Hello and welcome to another video. So this is Autoaim's other Shadowverse open deck that he'd actually won with for the finals. This was the Haven deck. It was very interesting. I would call it Amulet Haven, that's what I've seen it listed as in other places, mainly because most of the deck's focus is amulets and completely regenerating Pegasus Dullahan over and over again in the early to mid game, while using the big threats of Taurus Great, Heavenly Aegis, and Triple Heavenly Knights, along with something like a single Arc Priest to kind of just pull off those big kind of chunks of damage that you want on your opponent. So other than that, the only thing to really mention about this deck in particular is that it can be quite difficult to play due to timings. You want your Amulet procs and your Pegasus Dullahans to line up nicely so that you're having your Dullahan getting the most value. Of course, some of my gameplay isn't going to be perfect for that because I haven't had, hundreds of games with this deck at the time. I've only had a handful. Originally there was a JCG deck from the 11th of February, which was very similar to this deck. Most of the card choices were almost identical to that, but with slightly different numbers. From what Autoaim had said, he didn't have any knowledge of that deck at all and had managed to build this deck anyway for the tournament. So obviously great minds in that sense thought alike, and this deck has become a thing. So Amulet Haven, lots of fun to play, a little bit tricky, definitely requires a bit of thinking and planning ahead, which is pretty good. And hopefully you guys will enjoy the gameplay, so we'll get right into the video and check it out. So our first matchup is against Dragon, and this one is a more aggro variant of Dragon. I've been seeing a few of these floating around here and there. It's probably a deck I'll look at very soon again, just because I wouldn't mind seeing how aggro Dragon is faring in our current meta state, which is doing a fairly diverse amount of decks at the moment. I haven't seen any one deck really being overbearing all the time, mostly just seeing a good range of different decks, which is nice. So you really want to get your early amulets in your hand, really helps you to build your board. You also want something like Princess Snow White to be out reasonably early, at least from the experiences that I've had. Autoaim may have different opinions. If you do want to talk to him, you can check out the Shadowverse Discord. He does hang out there occasionally. But of course, my main aim with this deck was to try and curve it out nicely. So Princess Snow White into Beastly Vow into Hourglass works nicely with Pegasus Dullahan because it can be dropped, and at the time neither of these amulets will have procced, meaning if Pegasus is killed, it's going to go to one of these two amulets to be resummoned. When it's resummoned, it's basically just extra value on top of its amulets or already existing value. And if you can keep the train of amulets going, you're not going to lose that Prince Dullahan, which is amazing. And if they leave it up, you get extra damage as long as you have an amulet that isn't quite going to proc yet, like this Hourglass. I really liked the Hourglass for this being a 3 cost, working really nicely with its countdown. So Ancient Lion Spirit works out really well. I can remove an entire board with Lion Spirit and then go face. Of course, I do lose the chance to use Pegasus Dullahan now. The only chance it's going to have is next turn if the opponent kills it before this amulet procs, but if they don't, it's at least already done 6 damage, which is pretty reasonable. Also, if they don't kill Pegasus Dullahan, I can instantly follow up with Gemstone Carapace, which is just another amulet for them to have to deal with. So that's what I thought was really nice about the way you play these turns. Even if you have an amulet on board, if it's not ready to proc, it's still going to be really good. And as you just saw, that Dragon quit pretty quickly once you have a board like this. So the next match I've got is Shadow, which is a little bit of a longer match compared to that first one. The first one was a little quicker than I wanted it, but I actually had 3 Dragon matches in a row. 2 of them were tilting ramp decks, and 1 was that aggro deck. The tilting ramp decks got completely squashed very early on in the game, fairly similar to that aggro one, except my Prince Dullahan plays weren't perfect, because they were the first 2 matches that I've ran with this deck, like this particular deck, with all the cards the way they are, so they weren't the best. So I wanted to show you the best of one of those 3 Dragon matches, and that aggro Dragon was it. This Shadow match is one of the last matches I've played with this deck so far as of recording this, but this is a deck that I enjoy playing now, and I think I'll continue to play for as long as it's got some viability to it. So I do decide to remove Shadow's early game with the Bellinus. I don't want to see a Skull Ring come down and them have a nice Bellinus out of that, so getting rid of that early feels really good. Of course, I don't have as great a plays here. because if I had have played the Feather, it would have automatically procced, and I didn't want that to happen. And putting the Pegasus Dullahan out now was really my only good option. It felt like it was a solid enough option that if I have to have this removed, it has to be removed. If they don't remove it, then I can play March Hare's Tea Time, for example, and end up with much more value on this Pegasus. Which is the way it went, you know. March Hare's Tea Time now gets to come down. It's going to be extremely effective, a good 6 damage and clearing out the board. This deck works really nice on just flooding the board with followers that are hard and sticky, so that your opponent just can't clear them. Very similar to how Daria will flood a board, this deck does a very similar principle. I actually found a lot of the time I was winning the game in the mid game, and the late game cards were really just snowball effects off that mid game. The late game cards weren't really, you know, being a top deck win condition. They were more of, oh, I've snowballed the game to a point where these are already winning me the game anyway, so playing these late game cards was pretty much going to guarantee a win, more so than kind of turn the game around most times. Although Heavenly Knight is a great kind of swing card because it is a big ward and can get some really nice storm damage in, so that is one card that I had that was really good for that predicament. So they did kill the Dullahan, which is great because it actually ended up going to the Carapace, which means as soon as that procs off the Snow White, we have 2 more followers to go onto the board. They remove it again, goes back to another Amulet. Just like that, a perfect way for it to be played out. Although the March Hare's Tea Time without an evolve isn't great, so kind of unfortunate. And that shadow match was actually quicker than I thought it was. For some reason I thought it went to turn 9, didn't even get that far, so great. So I decided to put in my first game with this deck for the last part of this video. Those first 2 games were very quick, which is how most of my winning games have gone. The couple of losing games that I've had with this deck, which have only been 2, I'm pretty sure one was to a forest deck, and one was to a... I'm not even sure what the other one was too, but one of them was forest deck, which was just a pain in the ass, really. I just couldn't quite build up enough kind of tempo to keep playing things out. So this matchup was fine, except for the fact that I kind of screwed up my sequencing. You got to be very careful with your amulets and what order you're playing them in, because if you don't play them in the correct orders, you will stuff up your Pegasus Dullahan and it just won't get any value out of it, which you're bound to see here with all of my players. Because I'm running the Beastly Vows and stuff this way, only having them be countdown 2 makes it really hard to combo with Pegasus Dullahan unless it's on the turn you're playing them. So playing them now, for example, and then say playing Pegasus would be useless, because they would proc next turn anyway. They'd probably just leave the Pegasus, and I wouldn't get much value unless I had another Amulet to follow up anyway. I did play the Feather Hourglass. I should have played the Gemstone, then the Feather, and just left up the 2/2. Huge mistake on my part. Like I said, this was the first game I played with this deck, so it was really awkward and kind of iffy overall. I just couldn't get the Pegasus to combo nicely with what I wanted, and I felt that I needed to keep up the pressure, so I just couldn't get the Pegasus out yet, meaning I had to play this Carapace, and I decided to go with the Holy Flame Tiger, meaning that it was going to proc next turn, so Pegasus couldn't be played at all with it at this stage in the game. So Pegasus would definitely not be able to come down until mid to late game, which is kind of sad for this match. The opponent did have Fire Lizards. This was actually another kind of iffy ramp kind of aggro deck. It was interesting actually, some of this one. It was the second game I actually had that must have been Ramp Dragon. Like I said, I played 3 dragons in a row. Sometimes you'll muddle up which ones were which when you're going through them. So Black and Scripture, working great. Standard removal. All I can really do is drop a Snow White and kind of just leave my board. We do have a Beastly Vow, so turn 6, Pegasus Dullahan finally has something, just anything that it can go with, which is great. I'd rather have something to go with than nothing to go with at this point in the game. And even better, we do get the Hourglass, which means I actually have something else I can combo with the turn after. So really kind of lucky on those draws to fix up the mistakes I made in the early game with Pegasus. Plus, getting rid of these Banes really quickly is really good. Although it did cost me that evolve there, I think it was better to remove the Pegasus from the board now and put it onto an Amulet. It's going to be harder for my opponent to deal with in the long run. But this unattackable follower, real nuisance, because I don't actually have anything in this deck that of Autoaims that can actually target that effectively, especially when it's evolved. In its normal form, you could easily use a Black Inscripture. In its evolved form, I don't believe there's really anything that can hit that easily outside of Beacon. Beacon could hit it, but it still won't be enough to kill it. So these wards are really the only option to block out that damage. If they have a way to clear my ward, I basically have no way to retaliate from that. But next turn will be absolutely crazy with another Aether of White Wing and all followers on board. So it's looking really promising there. They decided to take the double trade, which is good for me because it removes the only thing I couldn't actually hit. And this next turn looks great with the Aether of White Wing to summon out another ward, which just blocks out that couple of damage and stops any kind of big swing from coming down, which the opponent obviously notices pretty quickly. So again, I'd just like to say this deck is great fun. It's definitely worth playing if you're looking for something enjoyable and it's a Haven deck and that requires a bit more skill and thinking to pilot, as you can't just play out cards and expect them to work. You really have to plan out which order you want your amulets to go. As you saw in my matches where I did make mistakes and where I didn't make mistakes, it can make a big difference to the tempo of the game. And I think Autoaim would agree with that statement, that the tempo for this deck, for making sure your amulets and your Pegasus are on curve and being played in the right orders, really makes the difference to every single matchup that you play. Of course, as I mentioned, there's no real way to deal with unattackable followers other than the single Tribunal this deck is running and the 3 Black Inscriptures. They're basically it. Although, since this was a tournament deck, it's not perfectly optimized for ladder, so you could mess around with some of the smaller numbers with things like Tribunal, Marches Tea Time maybe. You know, Frog Cleric, those sort of things could be messed around with a little bit till you find what you're comfortable with, but I personally enjoyed this deck a lot, and I'd love to see more decks like this come into the meta, as they're just some great fun to play. So if you guys did enjoy it, the deck list will be in the description below. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys next time. See ya.